to live fully in their time, free from economic or public dependency. And that is the broader mission which endures and will continue, I suspect, to be the core mission of higher education. But times change, and higher education is being asked, like so many institutions, to change with the times. And the most fundamental change is in the relationship between higher education and the economy. It used to be in the 1970s that a high school degree was enough for a middle-class wage and a middle-class lifestyle. That's no longer true. Nowadays, you go nowhere after high school unless you get at least some college first. And nowadays, the only strategy more expensive than going to college is not going to college. This, I think, is explained pretty clearly in this single graphic. If you look at the first bar, you can see that in 1973, in the blue, 72% of Americans had high school or less, and they were doing just fine. Only 12% had some college, and only 16% had a BA or better. If you skip forward 2 bars, you can see that the share with high school has declined from 72% to 41%, and the residual now, the majority of people working, people who had at least some post-secondary, and our projections, as well as the projections of others, show that that trend will continue. That is, by 2020, our projections show that only about 36% of jobs and job openings will require only a high school degree. So with jobs requiring only a high school degree disappearing, those with only high school educations are finding it more and more difficult to get a living wage, and that is true for the vast majority of men, maybe young men, maybe 80% of them, and virtually all females. If you look at the next slide, what you can see is that higher education is not only crucial for the careers and upward mobility for individuals, it's crucial for the economy on the whole as well. If you look at the orange or reddish line, you can see that between 1970 and the early 1980s, we actually overproduced college. The college supply was higher than the college demand. At the end of that period, with the black and the orange lines cross, the returns to college over a high school degree were under 40%. But what happened after that is really startling in the sense that we became a new economy entirely, and after that, the wage premium, the amount of money you can make with college over high school, grew from 39% to 84% and has held there, even during this recession. While overall wages went down, both for college workers and high school workers, the differences between them remained the same and in some data actually increased. And so the college advantage continues, and that is costing us as the nation. If we were providing enough college, that is enough college talent to, say, reach the Obama goal, which is to make us #1 in the world again in college education as we were in 1994, that would add about $500 billion a year in GDP. So this is not just a bargain for individuals, it's a bargain for all of us in the economy. And while the relationship between higher education and the economy has changed as greatly as it has, and while higher education or college education in general has more and more value over a high school degree, at the same time, we're seeing that there are new rules in that relationship. It's become much more complicated. So if you look at the chart showing now, that I think is still rule #1. The old rule still obtains here, and that is more education is usually better than less education. If you look at the orange lines, you can see the second from the bottom is the overall lifetime earnings of a high school graduate in real dollars, and that's about $1,304,000. If you look at the BA line, the next orange or reddish line above that, the earnings for a BA is $2,268,000, which is essentially the data that shows that on average a bachelor's degree is $1 million uh, represents $1 million more earnings than a high school degree over a career. If you look all the way to the top to professional degrees, which are the highest earning degrees, the difference between high school and a professional degree over a career is $2.3 million. And those numbers have been increasing, not declining, in the American economy. The old rule obtains here. If you don't know what else to do, go to college and keep going, although it matters a great deal which kind of degree you get and which field of study. The basic rule is go and stay and complete. One of the things that's true also about college education is that in some cases, less college education is worth more than more college education. So we show this chart in part because it's particularly true for Hispanics, that the biggest increases in Hispanic earnings for the largest share of Hispanics has come from the leap from high school or high school dropout to post-secondary certificates. That is, these are non-degree awards in higher education that take a year, sometimes a little more than a year. They're in fields like heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. But for Hispanics, those degrees raise earnings over a year and year over year by more than 40%, and they have been the first rungs on the ladder for most Hispanic Americans who go beyond high school. The same is true when you go up the education hierarchy. That is, 28% of people with associate's degrees earn more than the median or average person with a bachelor's degree, and 44% of people with bachelor's degrees earn more than the average person with a graduate degree. So it's not so much the level that matters nowadays. It's the level, but it's also your field of study. Your field of study means more and more, and your degree level, while still meaningful, means less and less. Rule number 3 in our mind is that the reason we see these differences in field of study and level is because what's happening in the labor market in its relationship to higher education is that it's important that you go, it's important that you graduate, but in the end, what you make depends on what you take to a very large extent. That is, if you are somebody who is among the top earners, and that's people who are in engineering programs, and compare those to the people who, with degrees in the bottom earnings majors, there's a huge difference. The average BA in engineering, as you can see in the red line at the top, earns about $75,000 a year. The average earnings of someone with a BA in psychology or social work is $42,000 a year over a career, and you can see throughout that in virtually every case, the graduate degree adds substantially. Sometimes it makes a low-earning bachelor's degree a much more viable career tool, as in the case of psychology, where the earnings goes from a BA at $42K to a graduate degree, and in this case mostly master's degrees, which will take you up to $60,000. Although again, if you have a high earning degree, that'll also give you a big bump if you get a graduate degree. So you go from $75K to roughly $100,000 if you get a graduate degree in engineering after the BA. So majors matter. They're not destiny. There's lots of differences. If you're in the top 25% of education majors in your earnings over a career, you'll earn just as much as somebody who is an average earner in some engineering fields. So major is not destiny, but it's very important. The most, rule number 4, I think, is a bit more complicated, and it's a good news, bad news story. And that is, first of all, Hispanics are increasing their college enrollment faster than any other group in the American culture. And that is very good news. But at the same time, what we're seeing is there is more and more access for Hispanics to college, that there's more and more stratification in that access. Simply put, if you look at this chart, and the Hispanic flow into higher education is shown in the pink lines, the pink person and the pink line, you can see that the vast majority of Hispanics since 1994 who've gone on to college have gone either to open admission two-year schools or to essentially less selective four-year schools. Now, to some extent, again, it will depend on your major when you get there and if you graduate, but the institution does matter in this sense. That is, if you go to a selective institution, they'll spend more money on you. If you go to a highly selective college, you'll get $60,000 to $75,000 a year spent on your education. If you go to a two-year open admission school, you're going to get a subsidy of about $10,000 or spending of about $10,000 to $12,000 maximum. So there's a huge difference in what you get. Money doesn't mean quality, but surely it has something to do with it. And at the same time, even among equally qualified students, students with the same test scores, if you go to a selective college, you will have more than twice the chance of actually graduating on time. And if you go to a selective college, even with the same test score as somebody who goes to a less selective college, you'll have a much higher chance of going to graduate school. So institution matters, and obviously it matters on cost as well as the benefits, which is where the dilemma is for most of us. And so the good news is that there's more and more access, and that has benefited Hispanics and other groups enormously. The bad news is, as in many American institutions, as access increases, stratification always increases at the same time.
So Tony gave you some of the rules, and
now we turn to Nicole Smith.
Hi, I'm not sure if there's a delay. Can you guys hear me? I'm hoping you can. So Tony just gave you some of the rules, and the rules generally say that more is better, and in some cases, you know, it depends on actually what you take and where you go. But now that we know these rules, we also have some real realities that we need to deal with, and one of the most important realities is the cost. There are many significant challenges that many of our students need to deal with. Many of these challenges have to do with finance. Tuition costs, for example, have grown substantially over the past 30 years. In the previous slide where Tony showed the disparity between the open access institutions and the more selective institutions, the difference in prices between those institutions can be anywhere from $40,000 or $50,000 a year. So there's some realities here that have to do with cost. Can we actually afford, and can we actually navigate through the cost? And the second thing, especially with the Hispanic community, we've observed is that there's sometimes a culture shock, especially with first-generation students. There's the cultural acclimation from being in a new environment, from fitting in with different personalities and different cultures and different ideas of stereotypes, feeling at home, adjusting to this new ecosystem that is college. So these are some of the realities that make it more difficult for certain groups to complete, irrespective of the rules we've identified before. On the following slide, we talk a little bit about the challenges, again, that have to do with attainment rates. I'm sometimes a little bit skeptical about policymakers who discuss the 2042 date as the time in U.S. history when the number of minorities, and the minorities are defined as African Americans, Hispanic, Asian Americans, Native Americans, mixed race combined, will be larger than the proportion of whites. But we must, in fact, also use active policy to target these populations to bridge social gaps. So a few examples are high school dropout rates is still 14% for Hispanics compared to 8% for African Americans and 5% for whites. Only 13% of Hispanics 25 years and above have a BA or a graduate degree compared to 32% of all Americans. So we have to deal with this challenge to ensure that we provide equal access to resources and an equal amount of resources for the groups that actually need it, so we can deal with the disparities in the attainment rates and the completion rates across the board. In this particular slide, I like to address what types of majors. So Tony at a point said to you, what you take matters. And this particular slide tells you, well, here are some of the lowest paying majors. It's often a conversation that's really difficult for us to have, mostly because, many of us might find, well, hey, this is a major that I might like, or I might want to pursue. Maybe my interests and values, in fact, want to push me to one of these majors, such as early childhood education, drama and theater arts, or social work. But we must do this with the recognition that some of these majors are also, on average, pretty low earning majors. So you have to be very careful about your expectations of your earnings potential once you complete particular majors. The slide that follows actually demonstrates the highest earning majors, and some of these majors tend to be pharmacy, chemical engineering, electrical engineering, but you see there's a common pattern here. Some of these highest earning majors just all seem to be STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So there's a huge amount of STEM here that's high wage. And if you go to the previous slide for a moment, there's a huge amount of early childhood or education, general education, agriculture, biology that are low wage. When you compare these slides, we find that Hispanics tend to be in the lower paying earnings, or tend to pursue those jobs in higher percentages than they do in the higher paid majors. So that's a concern. We are concerned when we have a disproportionate number of people pursuing low paid majors and not enough pursuing high paid majors. So students need to be aware of what the potential earnings for their majors could be. So let's fast forward now to a slide that tells us a little bit about expectations. Your major isn't exactly your destiny. Yes, I spent maybe the last 2 or 3 minutes telling you, well, if you pursue something in education or early childhood education, or perhaps you pursue something in social work, you're definitely going to make less than if you pursue a major in engineering. And this particular chart supports that. If you look at the first red line, the numbers in that red line go all the way from about 60,000 till maybe, I don't know, maybe 100,000. So engineers have a really larger wiggle room with respect to how much wages they can actually earn. You might start off at 60, you might start off at 70, and if you have experience in the field, you go all the way to maybe 100 or even over 100. But when you compare that to engineering, when you compare that to education, the people who pursue education, which is the green bar, start off a little bit around 40, so it's much lower. And your upper limit in terms of your wage potential is around $60,000. So we know that education on average will earn less than engineering, and it's much more significant. Even someone with an education major who is very experienced in the field and who has been in education and who's been teaching for a long time is going to earn much less than an engineer. And in fact, the very last gray slide often shows that you might not earn significantly above a high school graduate. So these are some difficult conversations we need to have regarding what types of majors lead to what types of job, and then what types of earnings you can have from that job. If we move on to the following slide, we sort of cement these ideas by telling you the likelihood of you being unemployed, of not getting a job, or being underemployed, meaning you have a bachelor's degree but you're doing a high school job. You are less likely to be underemployed if you're more educated. So if we compare this chart, the high school on the left to the BA degree on the right, you actually want to be over on the right because you sort of reduce the disparity between whites and Hispanics the more educated you are. So you reduce that level of unemployment, you reduce that level of underemployment the more educated you are. The following slide tells us a little bit about competencies, and we sort of move away from the general, you pursue a bachelor's degree in education, or you pursue a bachelor's degree in engineering, or you pursue a certificate. We move away to general competencies that make you successful on the work, on the job. So it's not just your knowledge in that job, but it's also your skill level, your values and personality, your interest and your abilities, all combined to get you that 21st century worker. So what we at the Georgetown Center tend to do is we spend time discussing the extent to which knowledge, skills, and abilities must in fact mesh with your values, your personal interests, and your personality in order to make you successful on that particular job. We wanted to highlight some of these competencies in the following slides, and to do two things. First, to let you know that this is the topic of an upcoming webinar where we will describe in detail how some of these competencies have changed over time, which of these quote-unquote hard skills and soft skills are the ones that are most in demand for jobs, and which of these skills tend to pay the highest types of wages for people who are successful in those skills. So this particular slide was just to tell you that most 21st century jobs today require critical thinking, social perceptiveness, oral and written comprehension, deductive reasoning, active listening as some examples of the skills that make you really successful on that job.
Thank you, Nicole and Tony. Please go ahead and send your questions if you haven't already. We'll take those just in a moment. Around the country, conversations and reforms are underway to help us an equitable society. We at the Center on Education and the Workforce were committed to releasing meaningful resources to support minorities to avoid debt and underemployment in pursuit of higher education. In a moment, you will receive an infographic handout in English and Spanish, which you can choose to download on your computer. The purpose of this infographic, which you can share on social media, is to help students avoid debt and underemployment as they prepare for life after high school. As we take a moment to sort through your questions, I'd like to call your attention to this brief survey. You can open the link on another tab and fill it out after the question and answer section of the webinar. Your feedback is important to us because it helps us create useful materials. So please take a moment to provide input on the resources you would like to see for your own professional development and any resources you'd like to use with the Hispanic and Latino community. As Nicole mentioned, we're in the process of putting future webinars together, and so your input here will influence those topics. Gracias por su colaboración. Thank you. So we have a few questions come in. The first one is, Nicole, can you take this one? How can we get more Hispanics into the higher paying STEM fields?
So I think this is always a challenge in trying to figure out how we can get, more people into the higher paying STEM fields. And part of the challenge is that many of the students that you address early on, or you find them early on and you sort of introduce them to STEM and tell them about STEM, they may not have interests and values that are similar to the interests and values of STEM occupations. So what we have to do is not address a STEM major from the higher ed level, not wait until somebody is in a senior or a junior in college to make a decision about what type of major they want to pursue, but we have to go even further and figure out in high school and in middle school exactly what type of STEM preparation programs that students are involved in, so that they can make that decision later on to pursue a STEM major if they so desire, rather than wait until you are already in college and already trying to make a decision about, graduating.
Great. Thank you. Another question we have is, Have you seen any significant difference between men and women among Hispanics?
So this is
For
a
Nicole.
pretty general question. I think maybe people are asking about wages. So what differences we see in wages? We see differences in wages between men and women. Sad to say, for Hispanic women, the wage growth over the last 40 years for the entire country has been lowest for Hispanic women. So if you were to look at the average wage of the average Hispanic woman in 1970 and compare the growth that average Hispanics have had till 2014, we find that the rate of increase of wage growth for Hispanic women is really low. And part of that reason, a little part of the reason, has to do with the attainment level, but it also has to do with the decisions and the majors that people are enrolled in, the types of occupations that people are enrolled in. So that's a challenge. Hispanic men have been much more successful in certificates and certifications and those middle skills and middle level technical jobs and getting high wages or relatively high wages at those jobs, but they have been much more successful than women. So if we're talking about wages here and wage disparity, although more Hispanic women have higher attainment than Hispanic men, the wages don't reflect that. When we talk about attainment, as I've just said, then women have been more successful in getting higher education and making sure that they get a sort of a college degree, much more so than men, but they haven't been able to parlay that into higher wages like the rest of the economy.
Okay. How do you measure, this one is for Tony, how do you measure the impact a Hispanic college graduate makes, say as a teacher who changes lives, in measuring the worth of a degree?
In some respects, it's very difficult to measure these things, but we know that they are, in the end, of enormous social value, and to some extent, our public policies reflect that. That is, to the extent that we give special provisions on debt to teachers, especially those who teach in difficult neighborhoods and low-income schools and so on. But by and large, the sad truth of the American economy is that people who help other people make less money than people who help themselves. That's a hard fact. I think in the end, the difference is in the psychic income that the people, this again is about values and interests on the part of the students themselves. This is about subjective value, that is how you see your life and its value and how are you going to use your time. In the end, that creates a problem in the long haul if we continue to have higher and higher wages for STEM and business and I guess to some extent other areas that are less about serving others. Then we tend to discourage people from majoring in those fields, and that's pretty clear. In education, for example, we've got a serious problem with early childhood education because people who study in that particular area really do make woefully inadequate wages. They essentially get paid like high school graduates. This is a problem that market systems have always had, don't need to have. That is, we can change the way we look at these kinds of functions. Ultimately, it's up to the public as to how we pay people, especially in the public services.
Great, thank you. So we've had a couple of you asking if we're going to be providing the PowerPoint slides, and yes, they will be on our website. You can also have a recording of the webinar. And the survey is up. We will provide it via chat in a moment, but the survey link is there if you'd like it. And we have another question here for Tony. Have your data sets also gathered income on how income is influenced by the amount of student debts? So how much debt must students take to complete their studies, and how does this influence their overall income?
What we know is that students who come from working class or low income families, and oftentimes with high concentrations of those kinds of students from minority communities, we know that those families are more debt averse. That is, they are much more uncomfortable with debt, both the parents and the students. And oftentimes, in fact, in some cases, what happens is they don't take out enough debt, or they choose educations where the costs are least, where if they were willing to take on more debt, they could have had an education that would in the end have had more value in a particular major, for example. So we know in the end, however, that for the most part, the average debt, which is around 30 grand for a bachelor's degree, is worth it. The debt is there to be had. There really are no controls on the debt. That is, we don't ask that institutions or the government, which is the source of much of the debt in terms of giving out the loans, take responsibility for debt levels among students and tell them, for example, if their debt load starts to hit around $20,000 to $30,000, to call them in and have a conversation about where they're headed, especially given their major, especially given their earnings potential when they graduate.
Okay. We will be sending out the handouts via email, the infographic handouts we mentioned earlier. That was a question we got. And our last question, we prefer having students research and select a career or major prior to researching colleges. Would you agree or disagree with this focus?
In the end, choosing fields of study is another case where risk is very real. That is, we know in countries like Germany and other European nations where people choose career tracks very early, in the 7th or 8th grade sometimes, but certainly by early high school, especially in apprenticeship systems, that they do change their mind after 4 or 5 years, that is, by the time they graduate from what we would think of as high school. On the other hand, the other point of view on that is that it's a good idea to begin making these choices and to begin to experiment with alternative career tracks, but as in Europe, that means that you need to have a system in place in which people can actually do the work to see if that's what they want to do. And we don't have that in the United States. We're moving toward a system where there are more and more internships available, and that has become our device for doing that. The internships are generally not of very high quality. They tend to go to students in the most selective colleges when they are high quality. And for the most part, people don't get internships in their field of study. So they're really not trying out a career consistent with their field of study. We know when the field of study and the internship or the work you're doing going to school, when the two are aligned, when they're consistent. If you want to be a nurse, you're working in a hospital while you're taking your nursing program, that has very positive effects on people's career choices and their earnings. But we have no established a system for that kind of applied and academic learning mix in the American system.
Okay, we have had so many good questions come in. Thank you all so much for your participation and for bearing with us as we work through them. Nicole, can you answer the question, as the Latino student population continues to grow, does academia forecast an increase in salary compensation for education majors, therefore making this field more economically attractive?
So that's a really good question. I think, but here's what I think my belief is. First of all, wages aren't necessarily decided by the size of a population. Wages are most often decided by the relative scarcity of those particular skills and the compensation that your employer is willing to pay for the scarcity of those skills. So there does not seem to be any indication that an increasing Latino population is going to necessarily result in increases in compensation for education majors. In fact, a little bit of what Tony had said before is we find that caregiving careers And occupations traditionally, over time, over the last 40, 50 years, as long as you're caring for people, you tend to get much lower wages in those types of jobs. So if the objective is to improve the lot for the Latino population, I think rather than forcing employers to pay more for those same types of occupations, we need to look at those occupations and have people expand their horizons to other types of occupations. For example, Gloria, I see a note here that Gloria asked a question that most students decide on majors based on majors they've been exposed to, and that's a really, really good observation. If you've never heard of some jobs, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what these opportunities are. And I think that this is why it's imperative that counselors sit with their students and figure out what your interests and values are, so that you can sit and expose them to options that might go above and beyond a 14-year-old or an 18-year-old's, really little world of what he's been exposed to. I mean, you ask every average 14-year-old, what do you want to be? They all say teacher, fireman, policeman, because those are the people that are in front of them. You rarely say economist. You rarely hear economists, and this is not me trying to be biased here, but you rarely hear those types of professions that are not necessarily across the board that they have been exposed to. So I think it's really important to make sure that people can mesh and meld their interests and values to occupations that might have longer developed career pathways that also pay well.
Great, thank you. So thank you for your patience. I see most of you are still hanging on as we go through these questions, so we'll go ahead and continue to go over the allotted time. We have a question about when we will have the follow-up webinar on the 21st career skills, and that will be, we don't have a date yet, but we will make sure to get you that information. The next question is for Tony. When Hispanics start failing in math, they stop taking higher math courses. They have no resources at home and can't afford tutoring. So how can we get them into STEM programs with their low math achievement and interest?
There's a complicated answer to that question, and that is that in the final analysis in STEM fields, higher levels of math through high school really are required. That is, Algebra 2, which is where most high school students begin to fail, is something you really need to get through in a fairly muscular way in order to move on into STEM fields when you graduate. In the end, a lot of this has to do with time on task. That is, what we know about teaching math is it's largely a matter of how much time the student gives and how much time the teacher gives. There is such a thing as talent here, but math through high school shouldn't be a barrier for the vast majority of students in the United States. It's really a matter of how much attention we pay to math with individual students. There are also issues beyond that, however, where to some extent, in many cases, Algebra 2 is unnecessary for arguably most college majors and most careers. That is, there are relatively few of us out here who go to work every day and solve quadratic equations, which is the core of Algebra 2, or what I think of when I think of Algebra 2. So math is an issue in American education. There's an argument that says there's too much of it taught in a very academic and highly abstract way, and that's part of the problem, which is that the way we teach math, we don't make it real for people. We teach math in a way that suggests we're trying to create new mathematicians. We're not really teaching people how to use numbers to solve problems. And so there are a whole series of questions about math that have come to the fore in the last decade or so, in part because we need more and more STEM workers, in part because Algebra 2 and math have become gatekeepers for a lot of students who don't want to be STEM workers and who really arguably don't need all that math to go on and do other kinds of things in college or in their careers, but do need numeracy, statistics, and a set of basic math skills that are more broadly required. And so the math curriculum in America is, I think, going forward, a major issue in education reform, especially at the secondary level.
Thank you. Nicole, what are some advantages that Hispanic Americans have in the workforce? For instance, does Hispanic cultural competencies or language skills wanted by certain are they wanted by certain careers, and do any of them offer a premium?
Well, we've been trying to find that for some time. We're hoping that certain types of occupations that required a speaker to be bilingual will then offer a wage premium for that. And we've had a hard time finding that that's true. So it's really been difficult. If you look at the entire U.S. population of jobs, it's only a few niche occupations that might pay a slight premium for fluency in Spanish. So as much as we wanted that to be true, I don't think the data actually supported that perspective. But the broader question which asks what are some of the advantages that Hispanic Americans bring to the workforce, I think goes even broader than just language, and also moves into just having differences in perspective, differences in approach, a fresh set of eyes, a new look, removal of this groupthink. Just having someone coming, at the other end with a different set of values, a different set of exposures, a different set of experiences can often have you think of your problem with more clarity. And I just this morning I was actually listening to one of those TED Talk discussions by a woman named Margaret Heffernan, and she wrote a book called Willful Blindness. And the objective of this book was to show that people who are successful in life seem to be those that dare to disagree, that might step outside of their usual boundaries and embrace differences and try to figure out how these differences might in fact be an advantage in the outcome. So I think the more we incorporate these differences that Hispanics bring just from cultures and values and to some extent languages, then this should in fact really contribute to a greater amount of productivity overall for many of our jobs.
Okay. Thank you, Nicole. When you compare similar careers, how do you explain the wage disparities between Hispanics and others?
At some level, there is no explanation except for bias. We know that when we look at, this is true for African Americans and for women and for Hispanics, that when we look at people who have the same major, from the same kind of college, who work in the same field, who work the same number of hours every year, who have the same test scores, that for some reason women, African Americans, and Hispanics make less than white men or Asian men. And that is the obvious explanation by elimination, because as much as we run the data, we can't account for that difference. And so the default explanation is there's some sort of bias in the system. These are people with the same talent and the same preparation in the same fields. There's no other explanation available to us except that there's some structural, systematic bias in the system. Whether it's in the institutions or in the people in the institutions is still up for debate. I suspect the answer is it's a little bit of each.
Nicole, the problem with a student who doesn't take Algebra 2 or doesn't learn it sufficiently is that the student will not do well on the ACT or SAT, which measures college success. How do we help Hispanics see the importance of learning math in high school?
So I think one difference I have with the question to begin with is that the ACT or the SAT in fact measure college success. I mean, they measure your ability to get into college. But we have a lot of data that shows that there's huge disparities in entry-level ACT and SAT scores, and all of these people graduate. So, but back to the question at hand is what happens if you don't take Algebra 2? Because of many of the entrance-level exams almost require you to take Algebra 2, and part of this has to deal with two things. First, you need to start earlier. than high school. So this has to come in middle school and elementary school, the required courses that build you up to that. And the second thing is there are many locations and many schools in particular geographical locations that don't offer AP courses. And when they don't offer those advanced placement courses at those institutions, even students who have the ability to take them are not exposed to them. So they are at a disadvantage when it comes to college later on, not because of their own ability or their own interest in doing these, inane courses like Algebra 2, but because they happen to be geographically in a socioeconomic location, maybe a lower socioeconomic status location, that doesn't offer that at the high school level. So there should be some concern for if the objective is to increase the number of enrollment of students who are Hispanic, to make sure that all of these high schools are offering the types of courses that get you into the schools, the types of preparation courses that prepare you for SATs and ACTs long before you are even a high school student.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Tony wanted to add something.
Yeah, this is at least in my own career, this has been a constant tug of war between the idealist and the realist in me. And that is, the realist always ends up saying that in spite of the fact that you don't really need Algebra 2 for 2/3 of the majors in college or 2/3 of the occupations in the economy, that's the way the game is played. So if you really want to get a kid a chance to go to Harvard, they better take Algebra 2. Truth is, they probably won't need it, but they won't go to Harvard if they don't take it. So if you're a realist about social change, you play the game the way the rules are written. If you're an idealist, I think you say that the rules are wrong and you try to change them. But in the meantime, whole classes and generations of people go by who are still stuck with the rules of the game the way it's played. So it's a tough call. You don't want to say to young people, don't take Algebra 2, you really don't need it. The truth is, if you want to go to a good college where they're selective, and if you want to major in a number of areas in college, like STEM or business and parts of business and so on, you really probably will need it. And we don't want to choke off that opportunity when you're in high school. So we end up making everybody take Algebra 2. It then becomes a point of failure for a lot of young people who would otherwise do quite well and move on to college and do quite well and move on to the labor force and do quite well. It's a dilemma.
Okay, next question. Can you clarify whether the 30,000 you mentioned in terms of average status students takes out, is it per year or for the whole period of college? Why are Hispanics more concentrated in open access colleges or schools?
Again, this gets to be an issue about how the game is played, and that is, if you're a higher education institution, if you're the president of an American college, it's either climb or die. That is, you, especially now, we're in a situation where money for higher ed, except for private money out of family pockets, government money is on the way out. It's being invested more and more in older people like me for our health care and our Social Security, and investment in young people is on the decline. So colleges are kind of on their own, and if you're the president of the college and you don't want to be fired by your board, you've got to climb and become more selective. The way you do that, especially in an environment where there's less and less money, is you have to find the students whose parents have the checking accounts that will allow them to pay the price of a high-quality college education, and students who have the test scores to allow them to give your institution the prestige that comes with a high average test score, which is the core metric in selectivity. So sadly, in America, those two things come together. When you find a student with a high test score, you can be sure there are parents that are relatively high earners. In fact, if you take the SAT or the ACT and you run it against college admission, what you discover is if you take out the test score and just put in the family earnings are as high as the test score as a predictor of where you will go. So there is a bias in the American system that pushes people down the line in terms of selectivity based on the needs of the institutions, which are competing for prestige and thereby competing for survival, and the needs of many students who are in fact, one of the interesting things about this is that the truth is there are many, many, many more students who are qualified to go to selective colleges than there are seats in selective colleges. So we know, for example, that every year about 440,000 high school graduates with test scores in the upper half of their class, and using an SAT, ACT type test. We know that they graduate, but 8 years later they have neither a 2-year or 4-year degree. And these are the kids in the upper half of their class. So there's we know that if you have a test score in the SAT about 1100, ACT about 22, which is both are roughly average, if you went to a selective college, you'd have an 80% chance of graduating. But you're not going to get into a selective college unless you can play football or play the tuba. So, you know, there is a bias in the system by which select colleges are much too selective. They're very risk averse, and because the industrial logic that drives them, which means that they're competing on the basis of prestige, not profit like private companies, pushes them away from students who are qualified but less advantaged.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and just would like to remind you we haven't unfortunately gotten a chance to go through all of the questions, but we will have another webinar next year, and we look forward to shaping it based on your input and your feedback from the questions that you've sent now and from the survey you're filling out. This question is for Nicole. What are some ways to get girls interested in STEM? Do you recommend a certain math curriculum that ties in with education and workforce development?
I think the interest here is getting girls interested in STEM and not necessarily interested only in math, because math is only one subset of STEM. And what I would recommend is early exposure. So the earlier you expose young women to the opportunities available in a STEM field, the greater your chances of engaging their interest in a STEM field later on. And I think with having worked with so many women in STEM-based organizations, rather than the math curriculum, they've recommended mentoring, early mentoring. So you have someone, a woman who is successful at an engineering program or a CEO come in and just talk to people about her experiences and her transition from high school all the way to where she is now. Early exposure and internships. So if you were to have some of the students, you know, even if it's an unpaid internship, or just get an opportunity to walk through and to see what are some of the different places that a woman with this particular type of major could end up, and what are her opportunities or some of the wages she can earn. I think that might be one way of gauging interest for these young women, much more so than probably just math.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are out of time for today, but I want to address, we did get another question regarding meaningful resources to involve parents in supporting higher education for their children, and that is one of the things that our handout focuses on, is how to help students ask those critical questions about themselves, about the schools that they're looking at, about debt, about earnings, all of those things. And some of the resources on there are My Next Move, which comes from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. There's the College Scorecard, which was recently released by the Department of Education. There's a federal student aid, and here at the center we have an interactive web tool that helps students do a search nationally and figure out what the earnings are for different fields. So all of those resources you can find on our website, and here's a link to it right here at the top. And we will be shortly sending around the infographic in English and Spanish that you can share with families, and we very much appreciate you all tuning in today and all of your questions, and we look forward to further conversation. Thanks again. Hasta luego.